this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate a method of joining a new ball of yarn while simultaneously weaving in the yarn tails. This technique is especially useful when working in garter stitch. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. When knitters talk about weaving in their yarn tails, they are often using weaving in as a generic term that covers a variety of specific techniques for dealing with yarn tails. The technique I'm going to show you today for dealing with yarn tails is based on a stranded colorwork technique that is actually called weaving. So let's get started. So I'm going to show you how to start a new ball of yarn at the beginning of a row when you're working in garter stitch so that you are weaving in the ends as you knit. You're not knitting in the ends as I've shown in a previous video, you're weaving in the ends. So you're trapping the tails at the back of the work. Now I'm going to show you this in two colors, but this would work the same if you were working just a new ball of yarn in the same color. So for Continental style, so here's the ball of yarn, and this is the working yarn end, and I've got the tails of both of the other two yarns in my right hand along with that needle. So that's going to provide some tension in those two tails while I work with the new yarn. So the first stitch of the row is going to be worked as a regular knit stitch using the new yarn. Now I'm going to work the second one by weaving the two tails in. So I'm going to alternate between knitting a stitch and weaving a stitch, knitting a stitch and weaving a stitch. So now that I've worked this first stitch, I'm going to bring these other two yarns over my index finger just to provide some tension on them this way. So I'm going to enter the second stitch just like I was getting ready to knit, but instead of grabbing my working yarn, I'm going to wrap the two tails around, and you can do that however you need to. I'm going to wrap those two tails around the needle as if I were going to knit with that, but I'm just going to leave them there. Now I pick the yarn. Now I'm going to unwrap the yarn tails like that. And now I can bring the working yarn through that loop. So we'll do this a couple of times. I'm going to do a regular knit stitch. And now I'm going to weave the tails. So I insert as if to knit, but I wrap the two tails around the needle as if I were going to knit them, but I don't. I stop there. I pick the yarn. So essentially, I'm wrapping the yarn as if I'm going to knit it, and I'm picking the yarn as if I'm going to knit it. And now I unwrap the yarn back the other way. And I pull the picked yarn through. Now I do a regular knit stitch. We'll do one more weaving. So you insert, you wrap as if you're going to knit English style with those two tails. Then you pick the yarn as if to knit. Then you unwrap these two tails back around and pull that working yarn through. See if I have enough to do one more. So I wrap the two tails as if I'm knitting. I pick the yarn for knitting, and then I unwrap. And so you can see that the picked working yarn end is still around the needle while the two tails have come back, and so I pull through to the front and I complete it. And so what you see on the back is that the tails are woven in. You can tighten up. There might be a little bit of excess slack in them. You can tighten up a little bit if you need to. So again, the new yarn is going to be this blue yarn. So we want to knit the first stitch. Now I find the easiest when joining a loose tail like this to insert my needle into the first stitch. And then I loop the new working yarn around the stitch like that, where the one that's on top of the needle is the working yarn and the tail is underneath. So I hold those two together and I knit the first stitch. So I want the two tails. Here we go. I've got the two tails. I'm going to hold those in my left hand, and I'm going to knit with the new yarn, the working yarn end in my right hand. So what we're going to do is alternate between knitting a stitch, as we just did for the first stitch, and then weaving a stitch. So we're going to knit, weave, knit, weave. So it's time to weave. So we insert as if we were about to knit. We're going to bring these two tails over from the back to the front like this. And then we're going to wrap the yarn to knit, as if to knit. And then we're going to let the yarns come back over the back, the tails to come back over. So we still have the working yarn strand over the top of the needle, and now we're going to pull it through. So we've completed that one. Now it's time to just knit a regular stitch. And now we're going to weave. So we insert to prepare to work the stitch. We let these two tails come over from back to front. It's like a reverse yarn over. We wrap the yarn and we bring those tails back over, return them to the back. And now we can complete this knit stitch and bring that forward. So again, we're going to knit a stitch, and then we're going to weave a stitch. We insert, we bring the yarns over from back to front, go ahead and wrap the yarn like you would normally, and then let those tails come back over the back, and then complete your stitch. Knit a stitch, weave a stitch. These are trapped. If you have a little bit of excess slack in either of the tails, you can pull on them. Don't pull too tightly, just remove any excess slack that you might have. It works well in garter stitch. I've done it down here in garter stitch. It works. It's a nice joint for garter stitch. I wouldn't use it in stockinette, and here's why. These stitches, you see how the old color is small, big, small, big, small, big, like that all the way across, and then in the new yarn you're seeing the offset of that. You're seeing small, big, small, big. So it's noticeable in stockinette when you're doing the two tails together, but you can't see it in garter stitch because of the way that the ridges work. So you're working it does the same thing. You get the same big and small stitches, but they're hidden inside the valley that's created in the knit row. As with any new technique, I recommend practicing this one on a swatch to get the hang of it and to compare it to other techniques to see how and when you might find it useful in your own knitting. In the past few weeks, I've demonstrated several methods for dealing with yarn tails that are each useful in some situations, but not in others. Depending on the combination of your specific project, the yarn you're using, and your own preferences, one method may be more suitable than another. Try them all out and see what you think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.